This is a response to Barklord's video on method acting and magic, and yeah, I'm kind of resistant to make this because I'm going to come across like a right theatre Lovey twat, but I can't resist, really. This is kind of my area. So yeah, you talked about Konstantin Stanislavski and method acting and I guess kind of possession or magical spiritual practices. Yeah, there's a couple of things. I mean, method acting is really more associated with Lee Strasberg, who was operating in the 1950s, 60s in New York, I think. And rather than Stanislavski, there is a relationship, and I'll try to get to that. But method acting under Strasberg, and people like Dustin Hoffman are probably primarily associated with method acting. That's when you really try and take on board the you try to really embody the activities that the character involved is engaging. You don't fake it. Stanislavski is much more about successful faking, whereas method acting is about embodying in a much more realistic way. There's probably you probably know that famous story about Marathon Man, where Dustin Hoffman was preparing for this scene where he's being tortured by I think it's John Gielgud. And Dustin Hoffman is like running around and getting himself all sweaty and doing all that kind of stuff, and eventually arrives in front of the cameras, and John Gielgud, who is trained in Stanislavski, basically just says, "Oh dear boy, why don't you just act?" Because Stanislavski is ultimately about technique, and it's a technique of successful faking. Brilliant, but I mean there is some interesting relationships there which I'll try and pull out because it is something I'm interested in myself. I mean Stanislavski, who's obviously Russian and working at Moscow State Theatre early part of the 20th century. He's got this technique, and it's a weird technique because it's a mixture of psychology and physical techniques, physical practices, and his physical practices are really key to what he's doing. I mean, there's one famous quotation from Stanislavski where he's talking about the unconscious, and he says that the unconscious is the body. The unconscious is the body, which I think is just a fantastic thing to say, particularly for somebody who's involved in theatre, which is typically not full of people with lots of brain cells. So he says, yeah, the unconscious is the body. So Stanislavski's technique it really kind of starts with the body. I mean, the psychological things you do, the psychological exercises, but it's always tied into the body and learning techniques of the body, which is fascinating stuff. But where I think it gets interesting and revealing in terms of what you're talking about there and interested in, is that coming out of the Moscow Arts Theatre, early part of the 20th century, were two other practitioners who were pupils, both pupils of Stanislavski. One was Meyerhold, and he developed an acting technique and performance technique called biomechanics, and it was really of its time. Early part of the 20th century, Industrial Revolution. Taylorism, that kind of optimization of work processes, all that kind of thing. And Meyerhold's biomechanics is like that. It's of the body. It like leaves psychology out, cuts the head off, leaves psychology out, and it's a series of exercises and practices for working the actor's body. Yeah, and they're a bit like kata from karate. These exercises you do if you're studying biomechanics. A bit like that, but stripped of any kind of psychology, any kind of spirituality, or any of that kind of talk, really. So you just learn the bodily techniques in Meyerhold. The other person that came out of Stanislavski's training was a chap called Michael Chekhov, who I know a bit more about, because after he left Stanislavski, he came to England and set up a school right here where I'm sitting right now, and then subsequently went to the States and worked with people like Marilyn Monroe, and did a bit of acting himself. But his technique was completely different. It was like whereas Meyerhold had taken the body part of Stanislavski, Chekhov had taken the head part, the psyche part, and all of his techniques are about the psyche, and it's the psyche which is deeply spiritualized and deeply made magical in Chekhov. And it's not surprising. A lot of his influences are all people like Rudolf Steiner and Goethe, and the whole Western mystical tradition through Blavatsky and Theosophy and all that kind of stuff he's interested in, and Eastern philosophy through people like Krishnamurti, a little bit later. So that's where he's coming from, and his actor training, which is fascinating stuff actually, uses all of the similar lexicon to the one I think you would be familiar with there, it's the lexicon of energy and fields and atmospheres and impulses, and yeah, it's that kind of a language really, and reading it, and it's quite an easy read. It's not hard stuff at all, and quite intuitive, because I think it's tapping into those intuitions, ultimately intuitions of the sacred, which I'm not justifying, but I'm recognising. Those kind of intuitions which we all have, I think, and which power a lot of our movements and our activities. And as I say, his acting technique is of that kind of order. It's an acting technique which prioritizes this kind of magical, slightly spiritualized version of the psyche. It's not the adopting of. I mean, obviously, it does adopt roles and do look at plays and you decide which character you are and all those kind of things. But his technique, which he referred to as a psychophysical technique, as I said, doesn't start with the idea of a character and then possessing that character in the way that maybe you're talking about, or letting that character possess you. It's all about this kind of this understanding of psyche, which I guess draws on much older understandings of what psyche is. Before William James contained it in psychology and locked it up inside your head. It's that wider understanding of psyche, which is powering the psychological acting techniques of someone like Michael Chekhov. Anyway, I think that's all I've got to say on that. Thanks very much, and yeah, that'll do. Bye.